Chapter 12. Elizabeth arrived back home well after supper time. She rushed into the kitchen and poured out the contents of her bag eagerly. If the jar of cocoa was just that, a jar of cocoa, she would be devastated, especially after the hope of some special trinket or important item from her father. But she had to be sure. She was about to lift the lid when Paxton entered the room, Jack trailing him. Her husband looked preoccupied, and Jack's eyes were busy investigating the contents of her bag, which were still strewn about on the table.
"Elizabeth, we need to talk,"
Paxton said flatly. Judging by his expression and tone, Elizabeth knew the jar would have to wait. Elizabeth looked longingly at the cocoa, and then hesitantly redirected her attention to her husband. Paxton's taut appearance and his intense posture were evidence enough that something was deeply troubling him, and her curiosity was aroused. Even so, Elizabeth knew she'd have to endeavor to concentrate, because her mind would inevitably wander back to the contents of the cocoa canister. "Yes, Pax?"
"I do hope you can forgive me, Lizzie, but I followed you to your father's ranch."
Seeing her mouth opening, he put up his hand in a request for her to remain silent.
"I just wanted to make doubly sure you were safe. Can you blame me? I can't lose you again."
He suppressed a ridiculous impulse to hold her close.
"Do you know who that man was that found you in the house?"
She shook her head. "No. He said he was inspecting the place for a sale."
"That was Paxton Stanton."
Her eyes widened in response to the name and the obvious implication.
"I didn't realize he was related to the mayor," Paxton explained.
"See, Elizabeth, we are in quite a predicament, because Paxton Stanton is—" he faltered.
"My brother-in-law."
"What?" Elizabeth blurted, instantly comprehending the connotation and the impact this would have on them. She was suddenly aware she knew very little of her husband's past, other than his career as a bounty hunter. On the rare occasion Paxton spoke a little about his father, but never the rest of his family. It was now all too clear she'd been entirely wrapped up in her own past and had never concerned herself with Paxton's. She felt ashamed, curious, and angry all at once. "Why didn't you tell me you have a sister, Paxton?" Elizabeth asked bluntly, feeling she alone was not totally to blame for her lack of knowledge regarding his family.
Paxton shrugged backwardly. "I didn't see the need to mention it. Until now."
"Why wouldn't you want to mention it?" Elizabeth persisted. "I just assumed you only had a father, since he is the only one you've ever referred to." Feeling downright guilty, Paxton put his hands in his pockets. He had never discussed his sister Amelia, because the very thought of her triggered a considerable amount of painful memories. Paxton's prolonged, silent stare at the floor was increasingly agitating. "Paxton!" Elizabeth snapped impatiently. Suddenly his eyes darkened with such a profound frustration, a look she'd never seen before. But he strained to keep his voice civil.
"Would you have told me about Maxwell if recent events hadn't demanded it?"
Realizing where he was going with this line of questioning, Elizabeth flushed. "Point taken, Mr. Reign. I've absolutely no right to force information from you. I guess I assumed There was no basis for you not wanting to discuss your family with me. For obvious reasons, I'm ignorant of any discomfort it causes you." Edging closer, she smoothed her fingertips across his furrowed brow. "I'm sorry." He collapsed into a nearby chair and sighed loudly, momentarily distracted by the items that had been dumped on the kitchen table. He tilted his head back to look at the ceiling before inhaling deeply and continuing. "First of all, Lizzie, understand I didn't withhold anything from you because I didn't trust you. Similar to your situation, I didn't disclose much of my history because I wanted the future to be untarnished by the past. My family life is something I tried to escape. It was not a happy one. My father, finding it difficult to make a living in the old country, decided he might have better luck in America. Back then, the advertisements spoke about how wonderful it was here, how huge tracts of land were simply given away, and how successful and wealthy people were. My father bought into that fallacy wholeheartedly, as did many. My mother, however, did not. She was skeptical, realizing they were merely trying to entice people to come over. The more people there were, the faster settlements would grow, and there's safety in numbers. My mother fought against leaving. In the end, my father came to this continent with me. My mother and twin sister remained in England. Being particularly close, my sister and I found the sudden separation traumatizing, especially being only 6 years old. Life here was not what my father expected. In fact, it was the direct opposite. He was an educated man, but not educated in the way you needed to be to survive America. He was stubborn, though, and had made up his mind to succeed here. He was too proud to admit my mother had been right, and too determined to prove my mother wrong. I think I adapted to living here much faster than him, which aggravated his already potent frustration. After 3 years of struggling, he came home and simply announced he was going abroad to, as he put it, broaden his career prospects. "Yes, I remember you telling me he came back full of news about Soapstone," Elizabeth interjected, glad she knew something of his past. "Yes, I told you that much. But what I didn't tell you is what I did during his absence. My father didn't leave me any way of surviving while he was gone. I was left entirely on my own, with only a roof over my head, which wouldn't last long if I couldn't find a way of maintaining it. I ended up going north a ways from my home and working at a lumber camp. As I was still very young, the men had me running back and forth with equipment, food, and medical supplies. I'd often travel into town in order to get those supplies. The men in the camp rationalized I was too tiny to be a target for the Indians in the area. Of course, if I were captured, it was of little consequence to them. But even as a boy, I was stealthy, quick, and adept. I'd made many successful trips to town, and back. But on one such trip, I experienced the most significant adventure of my youth. Little did I know I was about to come in contact with my first major adversary. It was an encounter that would forever change my life. I was walking back to town to collect some new tools for the lumberjacks and restock the medical supply bag. It was a beautiful sunny day, and I wasn't as focused as usual, paying little attention to what was going on around me. Suddenly, I was hit with a spear, oddly enough in the toe of my shoe. I was not wounded. I looked around
but saw nothing. I didn't expect to. However, since there was only one spear thrown, I judged my enemy was alone. I also assumed my enemy was young. The spear was obviously well made, but poorly thrown, indicating lack of experience. I knew little of the original occupants of this continent, but I'd heard stories of how tribes initiated their young. One such tradition was to send a youth out on some sort of conquest. I knew instantly I was just that, a conquest. My foe was alone and striving to prove himself. He wouldn't stop until I was dead. Elizabeth pictured a young Paxton, alone in the woods, pitted against an unknown enemy, with little hope of survival. You must have been terrified.
Yes, you would think so, wouldn't you? But I wasn't. Surprisingly enough, even to me, I was boyishly excited. I prepared for battle. True, little of the traditions and values of my adversary were known to me, but well educated in my own right, my father had seen to it that I continued my studies, I felt I had a chance. Retreating to a small hollow enclave where I was sheltered from unseen eyes, I considered my options, and reviewed what I had learned about the battles of Troy, Greece, Rome, and Carthage. Well, I was just a boy. The obvious way to overcome the Indian was to ambush him, but how? That question puzzled me. I had a spear I was sure would be wanted back, but I had nothing else. No shovel to dig a pit, no rope to hang a trap. I was unprepared, vulnerable, and completely perplexed. I almost opted to run for it, but concluded that I'd probably be waylaid and killed. I sat there frustrated for what seemed like hours, when I heard a loud crash and a heart-rending scream. My instincts told me the scream was made by my pursuer, and I moved to investigate the cause. Cautiously, but quickly, I followed where the noise had come from, and saw that a large tree branch had dislodged itself and crushed my opponent to the ground. My first and strongest impulse was to help, and I did, rushing down and hoisting the branch from the young boy's pinned legs. My time with the lumberjacks had acquainted me with many different types of injuries, from broken bones to sprains to deep gashes. The doctor at the camp, grateful I refilled his medical bag for him, had shown me several tactics of the healing arts. It was clear to me the young Indian boy lying in agony before me had 2 broken legs. Not difficult to surmise, since the branch had landed on them. Removing the spear from my back, where I'd secured it to my belt, I knelt down. I didn't realize the implications my movements had to the injured until I saw his eyes widen. A second later he seemed to relax, as if stoically accepting his fate. I suppose he might have been glad of the release from pain. I hurled the spear away from us, hoping he would realize I meant him no harm. "You are fortunate," I said slowly, ascertaining the seriousness of the breaks and not caring if he understood me. "Very fortunate. These are clean breaks, and I can help you." I got the medical bag from my supplies and began to work on binding and splinting his legs. I even gave him some brandy to help ease his pain. Once I was finished, he eyed me warily, still believing I meant him harm. I sat down and watched exhaustion overwhelm him. In the morning, I prepared a simple breakfast for us from my supplies and fed him. He looked remarkably well, and I was relieved that he seemed to have a strong constitution.
Then he spoke, which surprised me, as I'd assumed he didn't know my language. "You think I not kill you now?" he asked. "No," I replied, smiling congenially. "You've 2 broken legs and bad aim. Wait till you're better, and then you can try again." He watched me inquisitively for a while. I suppose I was looking at him the same way, sizing him up. He was strong, lean, and agile, and probably about a year or 2 older than me. I'd been working at the lumber camp for 3 years by that point, and had just celebrated my 12th birthday. "You stop unexpectedly. You lucky. My spear would have killed you." "It is a beautiful spear." I understood his insinuation. His missing me was due to my unexpected change in movement, rather than his own inaccuracy. Even then, knowing hardly anything about him, I'd a feeling his failure to hit me bothered him immensely. I chose not to provoke my patient with this line of conversation, however, and instead inquired, "How did you learn English?" "Missionaries visit my tribe and teach us English. I was very young. Missionaries leave. Years later, white man come. Kill many of my tribe. Now my tribe broken up. I am alone." "As am I." I informed him of my story, and he seemed a bit intrigued in my details of English life. In time, we became friends. At least, I felt that way. He never did tell me his true name. Paxton laughed at this. "I guess by the time we were friends, it didn't matter. I'd nicknamed him the Lonesome Stalker. Eventually it was Loney for short." Elizabeth smiled at the obvious pleasure Paxton had in this memory. Sobering, Paxton continued, "I brought him to the lumber camp with me, and promised to take care of him and pay for his upkeep until his legs had completely healed. Over the time I nursed him, he taught me a lot about nature, wildlife, and tracking. After he'd healed, Loney stayed on at the lumber camp, and as we grew, we took on more responsibilities. Loney, being older, learned many things before I did, even though I tried hard to keep up with him. Often, after a good day's work at the lumber camp, we would spend our free time playing what the young boys call cowboys and Indians. We became stronger and stealthier day by day. In fact, I owe much of what I know now to those days in the woods. Loney and I were always fierce competitors." Here Paxton's smile drooped until it was non-existent. Elizabeth knew this expression. She'd have to probe if she wanted further information. "What happened? Why haven't you mentioned Loney to me before?" "I was 15 when my father returned." Paxton spoke as though in a trance. "The lumberjack camp was moving to a different area, and since my father had returned, I decided not to follow them. Loney decided likewise. My father didn't mind the addition of a strong, healthy young man. He was starting a new business, selling soapstone, and believed Loney and I would be useful in his business venture. So for a couple of years, that's what we did, sell soapstone. My father had us educated, not only in academics, but also in building and installing soapstone fireplaces and sinks. You might remember I enjoy working with soapstone, but it was sculpturing that really captured my interest, not fireplaces. Both of us hated working for my father. It kept a roof over our heads, though, and food in our bellies. I must admit we were beginning to resent my father. and one another. My father had made his fortune, and knew neither Loney nor I wanted to spend the rest of our lives building fireplaces. Just after my 17th birthday, we were commissioned by a very wealthy merchant to build a soapstone fireplace. My father promised this would be our last job. He'd release us with a substantial bonus if we completed the work to his satisfaction. Unfortunately, this merchant had a daughter, a very beautiful daughter, just about our age. Her name was Rachel. Paxton paused in his story long enough for Elizabeth to guess at what he was about to confess. Loney and I fell head over heels for her. After all, we'd had very little experience with women. Quickly infatuated with her, I tried so hard to impress her. Loney had always been better than me at everything, and wooing an attractive girl was no exception, despite inexperience. Soon it was obvious that, regardless of my attempts to gain her affection, Loney and Rachel had become romantically attached. Searing jealousy enveloped me every time I saw them together. One day, just as we were about to finish the fireplace, Loney confided in me he was planning to elope with the girl. Mixed emotions plagued me as he spoke of his love and devotion, and their plans to escape to Mexico with the bonus my father promised. Not only was I losing Rachel, who I felt then was the love of my life, but my only and best friend. My hands began to tremble so badly that I dropped the tool I was using on my foot. It hurt badly, and when Loney started laughing at me, I lost my temper. I hit him as hard as I could, and naturally, a fight ensued. The merchant, hearing us, rushed in. Finally managing to pry us apart, he demanded to know what was going on. I, my nose bleeding and my heart broken, blurted the entire story without thinking. I confessed I'd discovered Loney was preparing to elope with his daughter, and that I wouldn't allow it to happen. Of course, I didn't word it quite like that. Paxton paused his reminiscences again, and looked at his wife's shocked expression. I know what you're thinking, Lizzie. Don't think I didn't punish myself every day for years after my betrayal and stupidity. I was just so enraged. I was beyond all intelligent thought. Hearing this news, the merchant glared contemptuously at Loney as if he were an evil plague, and left the room. Loney turned to me, a look of complete outrage and disappointment on his face. I'd just started to realize what I'd done when we heard a horrible scream from the upper level of the house. Instant recognition of what was occurring sent us flying up the stairs. The commotion was coming from the master bedroom. Rachel and her father were in a physical struggle. The merchant was holding a shotgun in one hand, which Rachel was desperately gripping, although he was viciously attacking her with his free hand. Her lip was bleeding, and her right eye was already swelling. Clearly, he'd been beating her even before he'd grasped the shotgun they were currently wrestling over. The merchant was obviously intent on killing Loney, and Rachel was bravely battling to prevent him. Loney lurched forward to rescue Rachel from her father's brutal blows. Grabbing the shotgun, I attempted to wrench it from his hand. Loney freed Rachel and hurried her out of the room and down the steps. I struggled with the enraged merchant until he regripped the shotgun and brutally whacked me with the blunt end of it. It was a fierce blow. I saw stars and collapsed, but I was surprisingly still conscious, a fact that further infuriated him. he was not at all pleased that I still had my wits about me, and was preparing to hit me again, when a horse whinnied from outside, drawing his full attention. Readying the shotgun, he rushed to the window, knelt down, positioned the barrel on the sill. I toppled over, endeavoring to catch my breath and move my legs. I tried desperately to get closer to him, when I saw he was preparing to fire the gun. I was just too far away to stop him. I heard one deafening shot, and then, after an agonizing cry, another shot sounded, echoing through the room and the air outside. I heard women screaming and people scrambling to find safety. For an instant, the merchant sat frozen, the commotion outside not fazing him in the slightest. Even as I lay there immobilized with dread and apprehension, I sensed his remaining stationary wasn't because he was recovering from the shock of what he'd just done, but because he was busy concocting a plan. A moment later he stood up, the gun firmly grasped in his hand, and walked over to me. "I can't believe what you just did. Shot those lovers in a fit of jealous rage. I knew jealousy was a powerful feeling, but to murder your best friend and the girl you supposedly loved." A cruel laugh rumbled from his throat when he saw comprehension dawn on me. He knelt down and whispered so low that I could scarcely hear him. "Yes, I knew you fancied Rachel, as much as the other boy did, and I savored the friction it caused your friendship. But listen, I'm gonna tell you a secret. You listenin'?" His eyes sparkled with malevolence. "I'm not a wealthy merchant at all, and that girl, Rachel, she wasn't even my daughter." He glanced up as the shouting outside got louder, and the certainty that he didn't have much time became evident. "I'm sure you'll want to know the name of the man who so cleverly dodged judgment and death. You'll want to know so you can curse it while you're rotting in a cell or hanging on the gallows pole in my place. Jeremiah Shearer, famous swindler and outlaw, at your service." He bowed insolently, and then cautiously placed the shotgun at my side. "Well, I must be off now, before the sheriff comes. Bye-bye." He patted my shoulder, and I remember his boots scuffing the floor as he made his escape. As I was getting to my feet, the sheriff and his posse rushed into the room. My mind still reeling from shock and grief, not to mention the stunning blow I'd received, my reactions were naturally very mechanical as they pelted questions at me. Eventually, being very suspicious of both my behavior and the carefully planted evidence, they arrested me for the murders of Loney and Rachel. Paxton stopped talking, a look of tremendous grief clouding his features. Shocked, Elizabeth stared at the floor, feeling profound heartache for her husband's obvious anguish. It was now quite clear to her why he'd never discussed his past, and had chosen a life of solitude before meeting her. She knew she'd have to wait patiently now, until Paxton felt composed enough to continue his tale.